Hello and welcome back to Era 5 of APUS History. And in this video, we're going to be looking at topic 5.5, the regional differences that led to the sectional conflict and eventually civil war. We will look specifically at how these differences in both culture and social categories shaped government policy, as well as how immigration from various parts of the world fit into this development of regional differences, and then how those differences related to slavery, causing the increased tensions between the regions. So let's get to it. First, let's take a look at some of the sources of conflict in the U.S. that also helps to explain some of the regional differences between the various sections of the country. And we will start with the rise of immigration, which was located primarily in the northern states. There was a combination of both push and pull factors that led to this increase in immigration to the U.S. in the first half of the 19th century. The main draw for immigrants, regardless of where they were from, was the availability of jobs in the emerging industrial activities, as well as the availability of land for farming. The two biggest groups that came to the U.S. during the first half of the 19th century were the Irish and the Germans. But there were others as well. But let's take a closer look at their experiences. The Irish had long faced opposition by the British, which governed Ireland. You may perhaps remember that prior to the American Revolution, Benjamin Franklin had visited Ireland and said of the Irish people, quote, "The appearances of general extreme poverty among the lower people are amazing. They live in wretched hovels of mud and straw, and are clothed in rags, and subsist chiefly on potatoes. Our New England farmers of the poorest sort, in regard to the enjoyment of all the comforts of life, are princes compared to them. Perhaps 3/4 of the inhabitants are in this situation." Unquote. When in the 1840s, the potato crop began to fail, which many Irish depended on almost entirely for their food source, many sought opportunity in the U.S., where the market revolution had created numerous factory jobs. Plus, of course, land is still abundant. But many Irish who made the journey couldn't afford to leave the cities they landed in, and some had actually even taken advantage of a British government policy subsidizing travel to Canada in order to populate that country, and then had instead simply crossed the American border, looking for work in the industrializing cities of the northern states. Most had little to no education and were willing to work for low wages and live in overcrowded housing. This, and their generally Catholic faith, spurred anti-immigrant responses towards them. And the common cultural practice of drinking whiskey attracted the interest of the temperance movement, which labeled the Irish as a plague on American society. Germans were the second largest immigrant group in this era. They were fleeing various revolutions that were happening in Europe, and more than 1 million came to the U.S. between 1840 and 1860. The Germans that came to the U.S. tended to be more middle class, so they arrived with more money and could travel westward to purchase farmland in the Old Northwest and beyond. So their primary economic activity was farming. They established German language schools and German Catholic parishes to continue to practice their traditional culture, although there's many German Protestants arriving too. In areas of the modern-day Midwest, like Wisconsin, there's still a very big German influence. Many of these German immigrants established breweries, which is why the professional baseball team in Milwaukee is called the Brewers, which would also cause them to be targets of the temperance movement as well. Germans would also experience nativism of their continued use of their own language, both spoken and in print. But they also tremendously influenced American culture, bringing into common practice the use of the Christmas tree and of early education of children in kindergartens for 4- and 5-year-olds. Although a much smaller group compared to the Irish and the Germans, Chinese immigrants were a significant group arriving in the western part of the United States, particularly in California. Many came during the gold rush, resulting in a thriving area called Chinatown in the San Francisco Bay Area. If not working as miners directly, many ran laundries and restaurants and general stores that catered to the miners' needs. When the Transcontinental Railroad was under construction, many Chinese laborers were recruited by the Central Pacific Railroad to build eastward across the Sierra Nevada mountains and into the Rockies because of their long association with blasting powder. which was also being used in the deeper corporate-run gold mines once the surface gold was panned out. The Chinese would face discrimination so great that they would be specifically targeted to not be allowed to immigrate at all. But that doesn't happen until the 1880s, so we'll talk more about that when we get to Era 6. Many Americans resented these new arrivals. This nativism took the form of political anti-Catholicism, directed mostly at the Irish, but, some Germans too. Nativists objected primarily to these Catholics because of their loyalty to the Pope, and also because of their supposed rejection of republicanism as an American ideal. Most of the Catholics and German Lutherans became Democrats, and most of the other Protestants joined the new Republican Party, making this a political battle for members as well. Nativism also comes in the guise of the American or Know-Nothing Party. It started out as a secret society working to limit the immigrant and Catholic influence in politics. Members were nicknamed Know-Nothings because when they were asked about the secret society, they would reply that they knew nothing about it. They believed that there was a Romanist conspiracy to subvert civil and religious liberty in America, and they sought to politically organize native-born Protestants to defend traditional religious and political values. They even advocated for increasing the time that you took to become a citizen, going from 5 years to 21 years. And they also wanted to limit the eligibility of elected officials to be from native-born citizens only, in an attempt to regulate that political involvement of these immigrant groups. They tried to instill fear in the rest of the American public that immigrants were stealing elections in order to mess with American politics. But in places, Know-Nothingism really only lasted a couple of years before disintegrating, mostly because of weak local leaders, very few publicly declared national leaders, and of course the very deep split over the issue of slavery. After the collapse of the Whig Party in the 1850s, Know-Nothings were able to gain election to several high state positions, at least until the Republican Party was formed, and many former Know-Nothings then joined that. Many of these nativists, though, feared for competition for land and jobs, which also helps to explain why they didn't want competition from newly freed slaves or slave labor present in the areas where they were active as well. Now remember, the northern economy is based on the concept of free labor, especially since the market revolution had brought factories mostly to the northern states. And factory owners typically wanted to make as much profit for themselves as they could while keeping expenses, which would include the expenses for labor, as low as possible. They resisted the development of unions and frequently cut wages to save money. But with so many seeking work, both amongst immigrants as well as those who were being replaced by the mechanization on farms and were traveling to cities looking for jobs, factory owners could easily find new workers. As many Northerners sought new opportunities in the West, many began supporting a free soil position, opposing the expansion of slavery into the new lands that were being acquired. The Free Soil Party officially exposed the expansion of slavery into the Mexican Cession, and they nominated former President Martin Van Buren for the election of 1848, after the Democratic Party chose Louis Case, who had opposed the Wilmot Proviso, which would have forbidden the expansion of slavery into these territories. They were hoping that by doing so, they could force the election into the House of Representatives. But that tactic didn't work, and Zachary Taylor and the Democratic Party won outright. Still, the Free Soilers would remain active in politics, even absorbing many former members of the Liberty Party, which was purely an abolitionist party, until 1856, when their position was essentially replaced by the Republican Party. Now, the Southern economy, on the other hand, it was based on slave labor, working on agricultural plantations. This kept wages extremely low for the few industries that did develop in the South, since slave labor could be used there too. And remember, slaves aren't paid, at least not the slaves themselves. Many Northerners didn't want to see new slave territory added, since that would make it nearly impossible for free wage laborers to compete for jobs. Therefore, these Northerners weren't usually objecting to slavery on moral grounds, but rather for economic reasons. And Southerners, of course, saw this as a very real threat to their constitutional rights. Of course, there were Northerners who wanted slavery to end in the South, and these were your abolitionists. Whites, free blacks, and escaped slaves all supported this position, but they were actually a minority of Northerners. Still, they're a very influential group because they use a variety of tactics to get their message across. Now, we've already looked at William Lloyd Garrison's anti-slavery newspaper, The Liberator, which was widely read in abolitionist circles. We've talked about Frederick Douglass and many of his writings and speeches. But another highly influential written work was the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, published in 1852 by Harriet Beecher Stowe. It may have officially been a work of fiction, but Stowe based her account on published sources as well as interviews with escaped slaves, describing the dehumanization and brutality of slavery in quite graphic detail. The book proved extremely popular, selling 300,000 copies in its first year alone. And it would also prove to be very popular in Europe, and was even translated into 20 languages, eventually becoming the first American novel translated into Chinese. It earned tremendous praise from abolitionists, and Abraham Lincoln supposedly commented, "So this is the little lady who started this great war," when he met Stowe in 1862. There's not a whole lot of evidence that he really said that, but it certainly sounds good. But it wasn't just Northerners who opposed slavery. There were some Southerners who spoke out. Hinton Helper, for example, was born to a slaveholding family, but he argued that the South's growth, prosperity, and cultural development was being held back by the mere existence of slavery. Supporting his conclusions was statistics from the U.S. Census. He argued that the plain folk of the Old South, those of moderate means, were being oppressed by a small but politically dominant aristocracy of wealthy slave owners. Many defenders of the institution argued that writers like Helper were actually trying to start a class war, not free slaves. Of course, books like those written by Stowe and Helper ignited a storm of protest from Southerners, who created a number of books in response that emphasized the benefits of slavery in the slave labor system. These tended to emphasize the view that African Americans were unable to live their lives without being overseen by white people. Congressman James Henry Hammond, for example, tried to justify slavery, saying in an 1836 speech, quote, "Slavery is said to be an evil, but it is no evil. I believe it to be the greatest of all great blessings, which a kind providence has bestowed upon our glorious region. As a class, I say it boldly, there is not a happier, more contented race upon the face of the earth. Lightly tasked, well-clothed, well-fed, far better than the free laborers of any country in the world." Social theorist George Fitzhugh went even further, arguing that slavery was the proper relationship of all labor to capital, and that it was generally better for all laborers to be enslaved rather than free. He insisted that slavery was not a question of race, that in principle anyone of any race could be enslaved, and that this was beneficial to those enslaved as well as to their masters. Fitzhugh declared that, quote, "The unrestricted exploitation of so-called free society is more oppressive to the laborer than domestic slavery," unquote. In later years, Fitzhugh not only supported slavery for blacks, but, like other pro-slavery intellectuals at the time, came to the conclusion that it was also suitable for whites if they were considered unfit, usually in a court of law. Well, that's generally what you need to know about topic 5.5, sectional conflict and regional differences. Be sure to keep up with your reading. You can definitely see where this is headed, and I'll catch you next time.